This is BBC News. I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. You join us at the top of the hour and we have some breaking news to bring you from the AFP news agency that Pope Francis has died. That's come from the Vatican. We just have that breaking news. Pope Francis has died. That's coming to us from the Vatican via the AFP news agency. We don't have any more details than that. This just reaching us here at BBC News in the last few minutes that Pope Francis has died. That confirmation coming through from the Vatican and coming to us via the AFP news agency. My colleague Rich Preston is with me here. Rich, just bring us up to date.
Well, Lewis, as you say, this is just come into us in the last few moments. A statement issued by Cardinal Farrell announcing with sorrow the death of Pope Francis with these words: "Dearest brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow, I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis at 7:35 this morning. The Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his church. He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage and universal love, especially in favour of the poorest and most marginalised." Now, the statement goes on to say, "With immense gratitude for his example as a true disciple of the Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis to the infinite merciful love of the one and true God." So that statement coming to us from the Vatican. Now, of course, Pope Francis, as many people will be aware, recently spent a considerable time in hospital with double pneumonia, including during that period being on oxygen for extended periods of time. There was a lot of concern about the Pope's health then, of course. He was released from hospital relatively recently. He did not take part in the Easter celebrations yesterday. He was there, he wrote the sermon, but he didn't give the sermon himself. We did see the Pope touring around in the Pope Mobile, seeing crowds, greeting people in St. Peter's Square. And now, Lewis, this morning, this news that Pope Francis has died at the age of 88.
Rich, thank you very much for that. We are getting more details in here and I'll let you just get across those. If you are just joining us, just want to repeat that news that we've just had in the last few minutes, the death of Pope Francis. A statement from the Vatican reads, "With deep sorrow, I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis at 7:35 this morning. The Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his church. He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage and universal love, especially in favour of the poorest and most marginalised." So that news coming after the illness that we have been, of course, covering over the last few weeks here on BBC News, and his health has been watched, of course, not just at the Vatican there, but right around the world. His health seemed to be improving because we did have those recent appearances just in the last couple of days, all unexpected. There was never any promise of specific appearances that he would make, but then he has over the last few days, over this crucial Easter period, of course, for Catholics and Christians, has been making a couple of unannounced, unscheduled appearances. But the underlying nature of his health was always underlined. Serious condition with double pneumonia, of course, and extensive hospital treatment. And then just in the last few minutes, that news coming to us in a statement from the Vatican. And just to repeat that statement, a short while ago, His Eminence Cardinal Farrell announced with sorrow the death of Pope Francis with these words, quote, "Dearest brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his church. He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage and universal love, especially in favour of the poorest and most marginalised. With immense gratitude for his example as a true disciple of the Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis to the infinite merciful love of the one and true God. My colleague Rich Preston is with me here. Rich, we have been getting, as I mentioned, those regular updates about his health over the last few weeks.
Yes, that's right. And as you were saying, Lewis, he spent a considerable amount of time in hospital with double pneumonia. He was 88 years old, so there was concern about his time in hospital. Lots of people closely watching the news while he was in the hospital's care there. But he was released not that long ago, with doctors happy for him to return to light duties, and the Vatican stressed at the time it would be light duties that he would be engaging with. But right up to the wire, he was meeting with J.D. Vance recently. He was present at Easter celebrations just yesterday in Vatican City, and then this news this morning announcing his death at 7:30 in the morning, local time, 7:35 this morning, according to the statement. Now, as I said, the Pope Francis was 88. He was the first Latin American leader of the Roman Catholic Church. And throughout his time, both as a priest and latterly as Pope, he saw himself as one of the people. He said, "My people are poor, and I am one of them." He was born in Buenos Aires in 1936 and was ordained as a priest in 1969 before becoming the provincial of the Jesuits in Argentina in 1973. And then it was in 2013 he was elected as Supreme Pontiff. And as I say, throughout his time, Lewis very much saw himself as one of the people working to help, in particular, poorer people and those who needed the Church's love and support.
That's right, and working right up until the end, because although clearly his duties were much more restricted than would normally be the case around the Easter celebrations there in the Vatican, he still was working and making unannounced scheduled appearances, and of course US Vice President J.D. Vance just over the weekend visiting Italy and Vatican City, and J.D. Vance then continuing his tour into India, but just showing the fact that he was still working and still very much involved with not only the Christian celebrations around Easter time, but also part of the diplomatic and political world that he inevitably inhabited and was clearly a strong part of, and perhaps representation of his style of leadership. There were confrontations between the US's policies, for example, towards immigration and his stance. There had been a reported clash over issues like that. But right now, the world and the millions of Catholics around the world will just be absorbing the news that Pope Francis has died at the age of 88, with words from the Vatican just a short time ago, in the last 30 minutes or so, a statement from the Vatican, and I'll just bring that to you. The statement reads, "A short while ago, His Eminence Cardinal Farrell announced with sorrow the death of Pope Francis with these words: 'Dearest brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow, I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his Church. He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favour of the poorest and most marginalised.' He had, of course, been ill for several weeks, receiving hospital treatment, but he had been released from hospital, and he had been making a few unscheduled, unannounced appearances to wish people happy Easter. Pretty obviously significant time of year, very busy administratively, logistically, and of course spiritually. Easter, a crucial time in the Christian calendar, and so he would normally be on a full work schedule during this period of time, but given the pneumonia, given the hospital treatment, he was not committed to the full schedule of appearances and work during this time of year. But he did make unannounced, unscheduled appearances. He appeared at Vatican, St. Peter's Square, to wish happy Easter to thousands of worshippers. At 88-year-old, he was using a wheelchair at that point just a few days ago, and he waved from the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, saying, "Dear brothers and sisters, happy Easter." His traditional Easter address, though, was delivered by a clergy member. After the blessing, the Pope was driven around the square. He passed through the crowds, pausing a number of times. Babies brought over to him, as is traditional. So although he wasn't taking a full role in the Easter celebrations, there was certainly a visibility and a determination to keep on working and to keep on serving. But this morning, just in the last hour now, the news coming through that Pope Francis has died at the age of 88. We are starting to get reaction in now. My colleague Rich Preston is here with me. Rich, just talk us through it.
Well, Lewis, the Dutch Prime Minister has been amongst the first to pay tribute, Dick Schoof, saying Pope Francis was in every way a man of the people. The global Catholic community bids farewell to a leader who recognised the burning issues of our day and called attention to them. Now, of course, these tributes will continue to pour in over the coming hours. A vast global Catholic community led by Pope Francis. And as I was saying earlier, during his tenure as Pope, he very much saw himself as a man of the people and wanted to unify the Catholic community, and saw the Church's role as very much being one of helping and supporting those who needed the Church's love and help. Now, as you mentioned, Lewis, he was working right up to the wire. We saw him at Easter celebrations yesterday when he was released from hospital. He almost immediately started engaging in what were described as light duties. He still wanted to work. He still wanted to do his job. He met the US Vice President just the other day. As much as he didn't give the Easter sermon yesterday in the Vatican, he did write the homily. And as you said, he then went out in the Pope-mobile onto the streets, and we saw him. We carried the footage ourselves here of him greeting people, being handed babies to bless, smiling, engaging with the crowds. He very much saw himself as a man of the people. He described himself as one of them. "My people are poor and I am one of them," he said on more than one occasion. He was the first Latin American Pope. Very much saw that as an important part of his identity. Of course, a huge Catholic community across Latin America as well. So this will be felt very deeply there, still early in the morning in that part of the world. But as I say, at the moment, we've got Dick Schoof, the Dutch Prime Minister, saying Pope Francis was in every way a man of the people. The global Catholic community bids farewell to a leader who recognised the burning issues of our day and called attention to them.
Well, you mentioned there he was in many ways a Pope of firsts. He was the first Pope from the Americas, first from the Southern Hemisphere, in fact not since the year 741. And there'd been a non-European Bishop of Rome, also the first Jesuit to be elected. So in many ways a pioneer, in many ways he led in a new and different direction, but despite those reforms, he remained popular among traditionalists as well. It is always, of course, in that role, a balancing act, a tightrope if you are an individual who wants to push forward with reforms or modernisations in any part of the institution. Of course, the huge wing of traditionalists, it is a balancing act to straddle both spheres, and that's certainly what he tried to do. He became Pope back in 2013. He was already in his 70s when he became Pope in 2013. But now the world will just be absorbing the news that Pope Francis has died at the age of 88. Just going to bring you that statement again from the Vatican. A short while ago, His Eminence Cardinal Farrell announced with sorrow the death of Pope Francis with these words: "Dearest brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow, I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his Church. He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favour of the poorest and most marginalised. With immense gratitude for his example as a true disciple of Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis." So we are getting some reaction. We have already heard from the Dutch Prime Minister saying that Pope Francis was in every way a man of the people. The global Catholic community bids farewell to a leader who recognised the burning issues of our day and called attention to them. And he did do that, and sometimes that would mean a clash with global leaders, with politicians, with parts of his own Catholic community. But he did manage to remain popular with so many branches of the Church and lead so many Catholics around the world who will all now be absorbing the news that at the age of 88, Pope Francis has died. His illness had been very public, pneumonia, his treatment, medication, procedures, often made public, his hospital visits. And there was a sense of not things returning to normal, that would be too far, but a return to duties, to light duties, a clear determination from Pope Francis to be involved in the Easter celebrations and commemorations and services and rituals at the Vatican. Such a crucial time of year for Catholics and for Christians. And he was determined to play a role, and he did. He was seen in public, he did speak, he did wish people happy Easter, but that was not the beginning of a return to full duties. And the news will be a shock now to so many, especially those who had hoped that his recent appearances were a sign of a return to better health, and there would be many people who would have been hopeful of that. But those light duties were not a signal of a full return to health. And this now, the news that Pope Francis has died at the age of 88. And I mentioned that we were getting some reaction in from world leaders, and my colleague Rich is with me here. What reaction are we getting?
Well, continuing to see responses from world leaders paying tribute to Pope Francis. Germany's Chancellor in waiting, Friedrich Merz, says Francis will be remembered for his tireless commitment to the weakest members of society, to justice and reconciliation. We've also heard from the Swiss president saying Pope Francis was a great spiritual leader, a tireless advocate for peace. His legacy will remain. We've also heard from Iran, Lewis. Iran offering its condolences after the death of Pope Francis. That coming from an Iranian government spokesperson. We heard earlier from the Dutch Prime Minister, Dick Schoof, saying Francis was in every way a man of the people. The global Catholic community bids farewell to a leader who recognised the burning issues of our day and called attention to them. The Pope, as we know, was recently in hospital with double pneumonia for an extended period of time. He was released not that long ago to start undertaking light duties. He was very keen, the Vatican said, to get back to work. We saw him yesterday at Easter celebrations in the Vatican. He wrote the homily for these celebrations yesterday. He didn't give the speech himself, but he did write it, and he was present throughout the ceremony. And then afterwards, we saw him head down to the streets to meet the people. And it was clear throughout his tenure that he saw that as a very key part of his role, meeting the people, being with the people and working for the people. Just in the last few minutes, the Scottish First Minister, John Swinney, has described Pope Francis as a voice for peace, tolerance and reconciliation. That was as he paid tributes to the news, saying he heard that news with deep sadness this morning. He went on to say that Francis brought comfort, assurance and hope to many. May he rest in peace, Lewis.
Yes, and of course people will turn and think about his legacy, his achievements, his failures. Referenced earlier, of course, that job of balancing, of straddling the factions within the Catholic Church, the conservative branch and a more progressive branch. And he, of course, at times upset both. Some on the more progressive wing, being not going far enough, potential social issues. Conservatives saying going too far on those traditional Catholic values. And so he had a constant job of trying to balance the different opinions within the Catholic Church, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully. Certainly outside the Catholic Church, when he travelled the world, he was certainly popular. He could draw crowds, not just amongst Christians and Catholics, but his words and work and commitment to serving the poor and underprivileged in the world drew him plenty of fans and supporters across the world, not just Christians and not just Catholics. But he did, of course, when he came to power, inherit in a lot of ways a church with many deep-seated problems, many historical problems, current problems. Of course, the child abuse scandal was a huge part of many of the years where he was in charge of the church. He did try to project a simpler, I suppose, model, a pared back image of the Pope and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, deliberately trying to project that image of humility and a humble approach to himself and the way he carried himself. And as I mentioned, a Pope of firsts in many ways, the first Latin America leader of the Roman Catholic Church. He took over in 2013, already in his 70s then, and now in the last hour, the news coming through from the Vatican that at the age of 88, after that period of severe ill health, pneumonia, the Vatican confirming that Pope Francis has died. And as we mentioned, we are starting to get the reaction in of world leaders, not just, of course, the millions of people waking up around the world and just tuning in and observing and absorbing the news. We are getting world leader reaction, as you expect. Pope Francis, a global figure, and we have heard from the French President, Emmanuel Macron, saying this: Pope Francis was a man of humility, on the side most vulnerable and the most fragile. So that from the French President, Emmanuel Macron, who's on a trip to Mayotte at the moment, meeting people there. But him making this message. Pope Francis was a man of humility on the side of the most vulnerable and most fragile. And as my colleague Rich, who's with me here, mentioned as well, Iran offering condolences over the death of Pope Francis as well. The Swiss president saying the Pope was a great spiritual leader, a tireless advocate for peace. His legacy will remain. So as we start to run through these messages, Israel's President Herzog saying this: Pope Francis was a man of deep faith, peace and compassion. And given the news is not even an hour old, Rich, we will expect now plenty more messages to come in from right around the world.
Absolutely, Lewis, and especially given the Pope's goal, his aims during his time in office for interfaith reconciliation. That was a key part of his mission. On one occasion, he kissed the Orthodox Patriarch Kirill of Moscow. That was an historic encounter. That was a joint call they made for freedom of belief there. He energized Vatican diplomacy. He saw the Vatican as key in bridging divides around the world. He helped facilitate an historic rapprochement between the US and Cuba. He encouraged the peace process in Colombia. And of course, there are social issues as well that crossed his desk, whether that's around same-sex marriage, whether that's war and conflict around the world. He very much saw it as his role to facilitate meetings, conversations right up to the wire. He was meeting foreign leaders, including the US Vice President J.D. Vance just the other day. So, as you say, we are seeing tributes starting to come in, including from countries like Iran sending their condolences, but as well as that, the French President, the Dutch PM, German officials, Isaac Herzog of Israel, calling him a man of deep faith, peace and compassion, who fostered ties with the Jewish world. We will continue to see tributes come in from around the world. Francis was, of course, from Argentina. It's still early in the morning in Latin America, so many people will be waking up to this news in the coming hours. We'll expect the tributes to continue to pour in then after this news of the death of Pope Francis at the age of 88.
And it's just to underline the impact around the world, not just within the Catholic community or Christians around the world. His global impact, he visited 60 plus countries whilst Pope. He is someone whose words and actions and principles spread far and wide and would have been heard by so many people around the world of different faiths, of no faith at all. He was someone who grabbed the media attention wherever he travelled, and travel he did, 60 plus countries in his time as Pope. He became Pope in 2013, already in his 70s then, and continued that schedule throughout his 70s and throughout his 80s, and right up until the end, making appearances over this Easter period in the Vatican, coming out, greeting people at this crucial time of year for Christians. He couldn't play the full role in the celebrations, in the services, in the spiritual guidance that the Pope would like to have played and would have normally played, of course, during normal periods, but his health was not strong enough. He played a smaller role, light duties, but he did come out and meet the crowds there, wishing people a happy Easter. And that will have been one of his final acts, to greet people close to the Vatican and wish them a happy Easter. Because just after 7:30 this morning, the news coming through from the Vatican, confirmation coming through that Pope Francis has died at the age of 88. we will be reflecting more on the life of Pope Francis. This is BBC News. I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. We have the breaking news from the Vatican confirming the death of Pope Francis at the age of 88. The Vatican released a statement confirming the death shortly after 7:30 in the morning in the Vatican. They released a statement, and I will bring that to you now. A short while ago, His Eminence Cardinal Farrell announced with sorrow the death of Pope Francis with these words: "Dearest brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the love, especially in favour of the poorest and most marginalised. With immense gratitude for his example as a true disciple of the Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis to the infinite merciful love of the one and true God." So Pope Francis died at the age of 88. He had been undertaking some small light duties during this Easter period at the Vatican. His weeks and weeks of ill health meant he was not playing a full role, surely not playing the role he would have liked to at this crucial time of the year for Christians and Catholics around the world. But he was seen in public. He was working right up until the end, and he did come out in public at the Vatican and greet people and wish people a happy Easter. He became Pope back in 2013. He was already in his 70s at that point, and in many ways he was a Pope of firsts. He was the first Latin America leader to become Pope. He sought to try and unite the conservative and progressive parts of the Church. He was successful at times and unsuccessful at others. He was known for his concern for the poor, saw himself as an outsider, and he sought to project that image of simplicity, humility, humbleness as a leader. And already we are getting reactions from leaders right around the world to the death of Pope Francis, who's died at the age of 88. My colleague Rich Preston is with me here. Rich, just talk us through some of the reaction that we've been getting already.
Lewis, in the last few moments, we've had a statement from the Archbishop of York. Let me read that to you. It says, "Let us walk together, work together, pray together." These are the words Pope Francis said to me when we met in 2023. They sum up his vision for the Church, both the Roman Catholic Church, but also ecumenically. Francis' whole life and ministry was centred on Jesus, who comes among us not to be served, but to serve. We saw that compellingly in Francis's service of the poor, his love of neighbour, especially the displaced migrant, the asylum seeker, his deep compassion for the well-being of the earth, and his desire to lead and build the Church in new ways. Francis showed us how to follow Jesus and encouraged us to go and do likewise. The statement does continue, and we'll have that in full on the BBC News website. We've had tributes as well from world leaders. Israeli President Isaac Herzog, who praised Pope Francis as a man of deep faith and boundless compassion, saying he rightly saw great importance in fostering strong ties with the Jewish world and in advancing interfaith dialogue as a path toward greater understanding and mutual respect. Iran, which is of course not a Catholic country, offered its condolences. A spokesperson saying, "My colleagues have just informed me of the news. I offer my condolences to all Christians around the world." That's the spokesperson for the Israeli foreign minister. We've had President Macron of France as well paying tribute, saying he sided with the most vulnerable and the most fragile, and that he did this with a lot of humility. These tributes, Lewis, will of course continue to come in over the coming hours, especially in Latin America, as that part of the world wakes up to this news. Of course, the Pope, the first Latin American person to take on the role. He was also the first Jesuit to be elected to the pontificate. Jesuits were historically looked upon with suspicion by Rome, and it's worth reminding ourselves as well, Lewis, that Pope Francis was the first pope in almost 600 years to take on the role after their predecessor retired voluntarily. Another first there, and we remember the conclave of the time, looking at the different candidates around the world. And of course, as he was then, Cardinal Bergoglio of Argentina, successful in being voted to the papacy. And he was already in his 70s when he took on the role in 2013, but he took it on vigorously and he actively engaged with the community, not just the Catholic community around the world, but world leaders, other religious leaders. He saw it part of the Church's role to help bridge divides and work towards peace and understanding between people of all faiths and none.
Rich, thank you for that. I know you will be keeping across those tributes from around the world as they come into us here. I just want to remind you of the statement from the Vatican in the last hour or so. Dearest brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow, I must announce the death of our Holy Father, Francis. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the love, especially in favour of the poorest and most marginalised. So people around the world, Catholics, Christians, world leaders, and many who saw or were impacted by the life of Pope Francis will now be absorbing the news and reflecting on it, that Pope Francis has died at the age of 88. We can cross now to our reporter, Davide Giulione. Just want to take a moment here and just reflect. Pope Francis has died at the age of 88, and people around the world will now be absorbing this news, Daphne.
It came as a huge shock for the Vatican, for Rome, and for the whole world. We can already see people running, the police closing the doors around St. Peter's Square. People are trying to drive there. It's coming as a huge shock, especially because Pope Francis, who was in hospital for 5 weeks and returned to the Vatican about a month ago, has been making surprise appearances. He met the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, yesterday. He met some inmates at a Rome prison just 2 days ago. Because he really wanted to be seen, he really wanted to go back, according to people at the Vatican, wanted to meet his community, the faithful all around the world coming to Rome, especially for the Jubilee. This is the year of the Jubilee, so Catholics are flocking to Rome for this special Catholic celebration, which was always seen as crucial for the papacy of Pope Francis. And now everyone is shocked. As I said, you can see people running towards St. Peter's Square. On my way to the Vatican, I even saw some people crying here.
And just remind us of the details we were getting about his health, because you rightly say there it was a huge shock when this news was confirmed in the last hour or so. But of course, we have been getting those regular updates about his health. We knew the situation was serious, and yet we saw him returning to those light duties, to meeting people, to greeting people, saying Happy Easter to people, and that will have filled many people with a sense of hope and optimism about the condition of his health. Just remind us, if you can, what are the details that we have been receiving about it?
Absolutely. So he was in hospital for 5 weeks, but returned to the Vatican about a month ago. in hospital. He was fighting double pneumonia, but doctors and the Pope's spokesperson, the people close to him themselves, have been reassuring not only journalists but the Catholics, the Catholic community all over the world. And the Pope has been coming out. He's been talking to people. He went to St. Peter's Square. He was always in a wheelchair, but we did see him with more energy lately. Over the last few days, been making surprise appearances, and people were really happy to see him. People were cheering, were clapping their hands as soon as Pope Francis came out a few times over the last few weeks. Obviously, when Pope Francis, the first Pope from the global south, is from Argentina. So, and when he was in Buenos Aires as a cardinal himself, he was always famous because he wanted to be close to the people. He was famous because he was taking the bus. So again, after his hospitalization, it was really, really important for him to go and see. Doctors have been advising him to rest, to stay inside. But he went to St. Peter's Square, and that's part of his personality. That was part of his charisma as well. With a few words, he could really talk to the Catholic Church and the world.
And given your experience, talk us through the kind of man he was.
So he was Pope for 12 years, and it was at the beginning. He came after Joseph Ratzinger, was Pope known as Benedict XVI, but Pope Francis had a completely different style. I remember I was still an intern when I was working in St. Peter's Square, but we were covering the Vatican on the first week of his papacy, and he started walking around very spontaneously, which is not what a pope would normally do, in the square. And the Swiss Guard and the Vatican police were just running completely unexpectedly to protect him. So it was very spontaneous. I was on a few papal flights with him for the BBC, and he talked to me personally about his grandmother. So he was really, really a simple, humble man who could talk to everyone about everything, because obviously we also know that he's been meeting heads of state, prime ministers. He recently met King Charles and Camilla, who came here for a state visit, and they went to see him.
And just talk us through the values. You talked a bit about the man and the spontaneity and the difficult being the security guards for him. Of course, with the bouncer runs in the blood, I suppose, but he didn't make things easy there. And plenty of the pictures we see of him, a big smile on his face. We've got to know the way he handled himself with world leaders and in public. Talk us through some of those values, though. What were the core values that he was driving at, and some of the changes that he was driving towards, and I suppose in the end, therefore, the legacy that he wanted to leave?
Is always spoken out in favour of the poor. He always defended migrants, especially. So obviously, his vision on migration policies, and all the political issues connected to that were at the core of his papacy. We even know there were frictions between him and the current US administration, especially with J.D. Vance, that had very different visions on how to welcome migrants trying to specifically cross into the United States from Mexico, but more generally, he was always, again, very close to the poor and very, very simple. And it was also his style. You know, when he used to come out, he often used very informal expressions such as buongiorno, buonasera, which is the Italian for good morning, good evening, which is not what you would expect from a pope. And you could often see people smiling in St. Peter's Square. At the same time, when he was in hospital, he called the parish church of Gaza City. He was really close to that conflict. He was always praying for the ones who were left behind. He recently went to Asia, where he visited some of the poorest communities in the world. So I think that's part of his message, certainly.
Davide Giulioni, thank you very much for that. Really appreciate those reflections from you, and given your experience of meeting him, we appreciate that. Just now want to bring you some more of the global reaction that we are getting from around the world. Leaders continuing to pay their tributes. My colleague Rich is here. Just talk us through, Rich, if you can, what some of the world leaders and the thoughts that we are actually getting through now.
Well, Lewis, just in the last few moments, the US Vice President, who's currently on a trip to India, has said, "I just learned of the passing of Pope Francis. My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him." And of course, the Pope met with Mr. Vance just in the last few days, where they discussed, amongst other things, US foreign policy. The Pope was very vocal on what he thought were the best ways forward on that front. We've also heard from the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. She says the Pope's death makes us deeply sad. She described him as a great man and a great shepherd. France's President, Emmanuel Macron, described Pope Francis as a man of humility on the side of the most vulnerable and the most fragile. Dick Schoof, the Dutch Prime Minister, said the head of the Catholic Church was in every way a man of the people. Israel's President, Isaac Herzog, said the Pope was a man of deep faith, peace and compassion who fostered ties with the Jewish world. The Polish President, Andrzej Duda, said he was a great apostle of mercy in whom he saw the answer to the challenges of the modern world. Pedro Sanchez, the Spanish Prime Minister, hailed Pope Francis's commitment to the most vulnerable. In the last few moments, the Irish Prime Minister has said that Pope Francis spoke out for the poor and for the oppressed. Lewis.
Rich, thank you very much for that. Well, let's speak now to the Catholic commentator Luke Devlin. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Just want to start with getting your initial thoughts and reflections at this moment.
Well, it was shocking news after having seen him address St. Peter's Square yesterday. We were all expecting a few months' convalescence, certainly, as he was gravely ill, but nonetheless, a shocking turn of events. And I think for those of us involved in the social teaching of the Church, the advocacy for refugees, asylum seekers, climate change, the works of mercy, Francis was an incredibly strong advocate for practical, applied theology, actually making a difference. His encyclical Laudato Si, really making the link between climate change and global inequality. He talks of the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, something he got from theologian Leonardo Boff. And these resources and that encouragement that he offered was really transformational within the Church, of course, building on traditional Catholic social teaching and the encyclicals of previous popes as well. But nonetheless, providing a bit of a new and opening the windows of the Church and letting in a bit of new light, so to speak. And I think that was massively encouraging and allowed people to take another look at the Church. We saw recent survey data which shows an upsurge in church attendance, especially among the young. And I think part of that is sometimes called the surprising rebirth of Christianity, a kind of cultural moment where people are looking again at some of the doctrines of the faith, maybe being alienated from cost of living and materialism and consumerism and wanting wanting something more. So I think looking at it
just on some of the points that you've raised there, that balancing act between the different depths of feeling on a more conservative side in the church, more progressive side on the church. How do you feel overall he straddled that? He kept that balance? Because, of course, he was fiercely criticised at times from both sides.
That's right, and certainly with such a massive global community of faith, as well as the Curia of the Vatican itself, which he engaged in some work of reform around. It's incredibly complex and nuanced in terms of trying to evaluate that, especially so soon. There were certainly some issues for some around his suppression of the observation of the traditional Latin Mass pre-Second Vatican Council, where Pope Benedict's liberalisation, allowing any priest to celebrate under that rubric, was curtailed by Pope Francis because he felt it was creating sects within the church who would see that as the only valid form of mass, and they wouldn't practice the so-called Novus Ordo, the mass in the vernacular in English and other vernacular languages. And that was an ongoing debate and point of friction among what you could call traditionalists and progressives within the church. But I sometimes think these divisions are not as black and white as you would think, because those who practice or who celebrate solemn, reverent liturgy and have a lot of love for traditional forms, such as myself, would also be associated with strong social justice advocacy and the social teaching of the church. There's also questions around the abuse crisis within the church and accountability and reform for that, whether he took enough action on that, and whether he also was involved in individual cases with people that were close to him that were less than satisfactory. But for now, we are grieving the Holy Father. We're shocked by the news, and he's going to leave an incredibly powerful legacy that we're going to be drawing on for a long time to come.
Luke Devlin, thank you very much for your thoughts at this moment. We appreciate your time. Thank you. We're going to speak now to BBC Radio presenter and Vatican expert Ed Sturton. Ed, just talk us through your reaction to the news this morning.
Well, after that extraordinary recovery during his time in hospital, when everybody expected he was going to leave us, it's, well, obviously a surprise, but also rather moving, I think, that he managed to appear before the crowds in St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday, such a huge moment in the life of the Catholic Church, and a sort of appropriateness, I suppose, that should have been the last time we saw him, and that he's died in this way. As your last speaker suggested, he leaves a huge agenda of change, which he half fulfilled. And I think the process of seeing what happens next and who the cardinals choose to succeed him is going to be absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, just want to bring quickly just a little bit more reaction we're getting here in the UK specifically. Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch has paid tribute to Pope Francis, posting on social media. Pope Francis spent his final Easter yesterday bearing witness to the faith he devoted his life to. A quiet presence at a time when the world needed humility, courage and conviction. His death on Easter Monday feels especially poignant. He reminded us that leadership isn't about power, but about service. When I met him in 2022, he spoke warmly of the UK and the values we share. In a world that too often turns away from faith, he stood firm. May he rest in peace. And just want to bring some of the other new lines we're bringing you from the UK, specifically leader of the Liberal Democrats, Ed Davey. Pope Francis's passing is a profound loss to millions across the world. He was leader of compassion, courage, speaking up for those in need and calling for peace in a world too often divided. His influence reached far beyond the church. He offered hope by reminding us of the strength in kindness and faith. We should remember his example, stand up for what's right, care for others and hold on to compassion and hope. Ed, that's just some of the reaction from the UK. We've been bringing over the last hour a global reaction because he was, of course, a truly global figure.
He was indeed. It's perhaps just worth noticing a curiosity with regard to those reactions from the United Kingdom. Very unusually at the moment, England specifically has 4 cardinals, something I don't think has happened possibly ever before, certainly since the Reformation. And one of them, Cardinal Fitzgerald, is too old to vote in these elections, but 2 of them, Cardinal Nichols is 79, and of course the cutoff point for voting is 80. And Cardinal Roche, who actually works in Rome, is also English. And somebody called Timothy Ratcliffe, who was an unexpected cardinal, very close to the Pope, was appointed last year. So he had a certain sort of affection, it would appear, for us Brits. But as you say, a worldwide figure, and the Catholic Church's sort of reach and agenda is so huge that it really does touch pretty much every part of the world. One of the things that marked his pontificate was an attempt to refocus, if you like, the Church beyond Europe. And he appointed all sorts of cardinals from different parts of the world that had never had cardinals before. Mongolia has one now, I think, and Myanmar. And that was all part of his agenda, which was, given that he was the first pope from Latin America, was to say the Church may have had a huge amount of history in Europe, but Europe really is no longer the centre of the Church. It is a worldwide institution with extraordinary reach. And part of his reform process was to get that reflected in the way the Church is run by, as I say, appointing all sorts of senior figures from non-traditional places, if you like.
And Ed, I know it's difficult to try and sum up these things. He became Pope in 2013. Talk us through the legacy, or at least some of his values that drove him, what he was trying to achieve. It may be too early to assess legacies, but where do you think he was driving at, and how successful or not do you think he was?
Well, I think it's worth remembering that at the time that he became Pope, the Church really was in a state of crisis. His predecessor, Pope Benedict, had resigned, something unprecedented in many centuries. And there was a sense that the Church was almost out of control at that stage, with a whole series of scandals. And I think one of the first things that he did was restore a sense of purpose and direction. Some people, of course, didn't like the direction in which he took the Church, but he was very clear about, broadly speaking, what he was trying to achieve. Reform is probably the best word, although political terms never quite work when applied to religious institutions. But in a whole range of areas where there was a feeling, I think, among many ordinary Catholics, particularly in Europe and North America, that the Church has rather got left behind, he tried to introduce change. The Catholic Church is a very conservative in its sort of constitution and its genes, if you like, institution. So that was a very, very sticky process. And I think if he was listening to this, or if we asked him himself, he'd probably said, I got about halfway with where I wanted to go. I'll give you an illustration, if you like, in terms of the role of women in the Church. But very early on, he introduced a kind of conversation about the possibility, not of ordaining women as priests, because that's a hugely controversial subject, but of ordaining women as deacons, which is a slightly junior role, but nevertheless one that requires ordination. And that whole push really sort of ran out of steam. It never really went anywhere. But at the same time, what he has done is he's appointed women to all sorts of very senior positions in the Church, positions which in the past have been held by men, by cardinals, by princes of the Church, and are now held mostly by religious women, religious in the sense that they're nuns. So the governor of the Vatican city-state at the moment is a woman, something that's never happened before. So he broke the link, if you like, between ordination and power, and used that, breaking that link to give more power, I think, to many women. But of course, many women in the Church would say that he didn't go nearly far enough, and the whole question of ordination remains very much open. If you look equally at the question of gay relationships, he said very early on, as you know, many people will remember, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about gay sex, which was an astonishing thing at the time. If you remember his predecessor, Pope Benedict, when he was head of the Vatican's sort of ideological body, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith,